Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our Wednesday evening reading of the book of Ecclesiastes, coming a little differently this week as you are going to be watching a pre-taped episode, and so I hope everything is going to be okay with that. But we're in Ecclesiastes chapter 9 and chapter 10. We're nearing the end of this wonderful book, and I hope that you've enjoyed reading through this Old Testament book. It's one of the groundbreaking books of wisdom, biblical wisdom literature, and it has a lot to say for our own walks of life with God here in an unpredictable life. And so we're going to continue as we've been doing, and I'm going to play a couple of songs, and hopefully you'll enjoy these songs. You can listen to them, sing them along, but they're songs that we know pretty good. So,
Lord, I lift your name on high. Lord, I love to sing your praises. I'm so glad you're in my life. I'm so glad you came to save us. You came from heaven to earth to show the way, from the earth to the cross, my debt to pay, from the cross to the grave, from the grave to the sky. Lord, I lift your name on high. Lord, I lift your name on high. Lord, I love to sing your praises. I'm so glad you're in my life. I'm so glad you came to save us. You came from heaven to earth to show the way, from the earth to the cross, my debt to pay, from the cross to the grave, from the grave to the sky. Lord, I lift your name on high. You came from heaven to earth to show the way, from the earth to the cross, my debt to pay, from the cross to the grave, from the grave to the sky. Lord, I lift your name on high.
certainly appreciate those songs from Taylor Publications. I really like that last song a lot. Oh Lord, you're beautiful. And that kind of goes with what we have been talking about through the book of Ecclesiastes. It goes with a lot of what the Bible has to say. There's a lot about life that is unpredictable. There's a lot about life that could be frustrating if we're trying to control situations and unexpected things happen. And Solomon reminds us, doesn't he, that we can live in the tension, right? And we can live with joy in the tension, that we don't deny the existence of God. We don't deny the power and goodness of God. And at the same time, we don't deny the reality of evil. And we might get involved in a lot of discussions of why God doesn't just stop certain things, but Solomon really doesn't get into that. Solomon just basically says we affirm all of these, and therefore he comes to that conclusion that we kind of spoke about, that he knows it's going to be well with the righteous in the end. And even if it's not working out the way it's supposed to in this life, somehow it's going to be all right with the righteous in the end. And so when he was talking about in his earlier part of the book about all life is meaningless or absurd or vain, those weren't his conclusions, but those are only his conclusions from a view of this life only. Things just don't work out the way they're supposed to all the time. You can't control life with formulas, and there's certain rules of life that we have, and they often do work out, and if things go according to plan, it should work out, but what happens when they don't, right? And so sometimes what's supposed to happen to the righteous happens to the wicked, and what's supposed to happen to the wicked happens to the righteous, and we're left with a frustration on our hands, but we live in the tension that God is still good, God is still real, and yet, yes, evil is still real. And we just have to trust that somehow things are going to be worked out properly sometime. And so as he began chapter 9 last week, Solomon says that, remember he said, the righteous and the wise and the deeds are in the hands of God. And that's an important truth to hold on to, that the righteous are in the hands of God, because that plays out the rest of the way as Solomon prepares us for his overall conclusion about life. And so anyways, I was thinking this week, you have King David, and David was such a mighty king, and he did so many great, powerful deeds, and yet he wrote those psalms sometimes that we go to for comfort, right? That we go to for soothing. We go to in order to inquire about how beautiful our God is. And then you've got his son Solomon, who was a majestic writer in his own right, and he wrote Proverbs and Ecclesiastes and the Song of Solomon. And this father-son duo are quite extraordinary when we consider it. So anyways, we're going to pick it up, chapter 9, verse 7, and we're going to go through chapter 10 today, but we're not going to be focusing on chapter 10 as intently. I think you'll notice, even as it's written in your own Bibles, it goes back to kind of like a Proverbs-style writing, and it's important, and we don't want to diminish the value of it, but it's a lot of like loose writing, if you want to put it that way. And so we're going to just skim through it a little bit, because you'll see it in chunks of teaching and everything. So chapter 9, beginning at verse 7, and we're going to read the rest right through to verse 18. Solomon says, "Go, eat your bread in joy, and drink your wine with a merry heart, for God has already approved what you do. Let your garments be always white, let not oil be lacking on your head. Enjoy life with the wife whom you love, all the days of your vain life that he has given you under the sun, because that is your portion in life and in your toil at which you toil under the sun. Whatever your hand finds to do, do it with your might, for there is no work or thought or knowledge or wisdom in Sheol to which you are going. Again, I saw that under the sun the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, nor bread to the wise, nor riches to the intelligent, nor favor to those with knowledge. But time and chance happen to them all. For man does not know his time, like fish that are taken in an evil net, and like birds that are caught in a snare, so the children of man are snared at an evil time when it suddenly falls upon them. I have also seen this example of wisdom under the sun, and it seemed great to me. There was a little city with few men in it, and a great king came against it and besieged it, building great siege works against it. But there was found in it a poor wise man, and he by his wisdom delivered the city. Yet no one remembered that poor man. But I say that wisdom is better than might, though the poor man's wisdom is despised, and his words are not heard. The words of the wise, heard in quiet, are better than the shouting of a ruler among fools. Wisdom is better than weapons of war, but one sinner destroys much good." I was thinking this week when I read that line of verse 17, the words of the wise heard in quiet are better than the shouting of a ruler among fools. And, political debates in modern times have become really shouting matches at times, and it just sounds like fools shouting at one another. And sometimes people are attracted to people who can be louder and angrier and have the best put down. But years after they were both presidents, President Ford and President Carter did a kind of tour, and where they sat down opposite each other on stages in front of people who were interested, and they debated issues that were pertinent to the time. And it was interesting to listen to these two elder statesmen as they were able to speak in friendly tones to one another and have discussions and highlight where they agreed and talk about where they disagreed. But really it was a gentleman's discussion, and I thought if how much better our world might be if we went back to such civility, right? That people could have discussions of respect. And the words of the wise heard in quiet are better than the shouting of a ruler among fools. And Solomon has some great statements there. And he really does know, doesn't he? He knows that the words of wisdom are much better to hear than just the shouting of fools. And one thing about shouting, it causes our own adrenaline to rise, right? And we get all worked up and everything like that. But the words of the wise in quiet are better than the shouting of fools. So we begin in chapter 9, verses 7 through 10. Solomon returns to his recurring theme about joy being a gift from God. And instead of having a life where we're constantly pursuing things, whether it's pleasures or assets or whatever, and never quite accumulating enough, and then maybe we've accumulated enough, and then we realize, hey, we got to leave it all behind, and so there's desperation there. You know, kind of like that rich fool, right, who has everything he could possibly want, and he says, I'm going to tear down these barns and build bigger barns, and then he discovers that he's got to leave it all, and he's actually a fool for doing so. Solomon says, joy is the gift of God, so discover joy in the everyday life. And he adds a little bit to it, right? Eat your bread in joy, drink your wine with a merry heart, for God has already approved what you do. And so whatever of life remains unexplained, whatever of life remains unpredictable, that should not keep us from enjoying life, what we can in life. Don't get so worked up over all the questions that you cannot answer or cannot control. That shouldn't keep you from enjoying what you can in life. And your daily bread is something you can eat in joy. The wine that you drink is something you can drink with a merry heart. And then he says this thing that God has already approved what you do. And so remember this, that the righteous are in the hands of God. And even though they're going to die like everyone else, enjoy life still. Because God has already approved what you're doing. God has already approved the righteous. So just go ahead and eat and find your life to be one of joy. Find joy in it. He says, let your garments be white. Let not oil be lacking on your head. Like, don't go around mourning. Stay in purity. But go around and be festive about life. Enjoy life. And he goes into something that is kind of interesting coming from Solomon. We need to both recognize and rejoice in even the smallest gifts that are good from God. We sometimes say we're thankful that we're not like so-and-so of the world who don't have the things we have, right? We can say something like that. Like if we have a roof over our head and food in our fridge and, a supper to eat every day, we've got a lot that a lot of people in the world don't have. But don't just be thankful because you're not like other people. Rejoice in these gifts. Don't take these things for granted, right? But then Solomon says something, it's kind of interesting coming from Solomon, right? The man of so many wives and so many concubines. And he says something, and we talked about this, about foolishness and wisdom being personified. Remember, he said, I have not found a woman among all these, right? One man among 1,000 I found, remember back in chapter 7, but a woman among all these I have not found. And people have thought this was a very put down of women, that you'd only find one wise man among 1,000, you wouldn't find any women among 1,000. But that's not really what Solomon might be saying there. It's Solomon's own experience, right? He's gone after so many different women. And in his own life, they did not bring him the joy or satisfaction that lust really promises to bring. And this is the challenge here. And so Solomon comes to us with a really important biblical sounding advice. Enjoy life with the wife whom you love. Now, don't get rid of some of the words here. It doesn't say enjoy your wife. But these are very important. Enjoy life with the wife whom you love. So all of those words are important here. We live in a time where people say, well, people don't take marriage seriously anymore. And that's not really, that's too general a statement. It's not looking at it as deeply as it should. We live in a time, beginning about the 1950s, we live in a time that's been unparalleled in history, in that marriage is now something where both partners are being given a voice. And some people say, well, we gave women too much freedom and that's why now there's so much divorce. But it may be that men don't know how to handle the freedom of the women either. And it's just more complex than just simply saying people don't take marriage as serious anymore. It may be that there's more options than there ever were before, but it doesn't take the responsibility of marriage. Now, see, this is one of the issues we have here, is that today's world, there is a problem, is that people marry to enjoy life, and if I no longer enjoy life, then I leave you and find someone else. And that's really not what God has in mind. It's not healthy. It's not good. We might say history in the other way was you got married and it didn't matter if you enjoyed your life. Well, that wasn't the way God wanted either. And all these words are important here. Enjoy life with the wife whom you love. And so Paul says, husbands, love your wives, right? And this isn't something like, you don't just get married and stay married. You get married and you enjoy life with the wife whom you love. That husbands and wives need to learn to live it up together. They need to learn to enjoy life together. They need to allow themselves to enjoy life together. And this is something that, a successful marriage is not just one that stays together. A successful marriage is one that enjoys life together. Enjoy life with the wife whom you love. And yes, there's going to be times when there's difficulties and so on like that, but you must pursue enjoying life with the wife whom you love. And you'll notice, because that is your portion in life and in your toil at which you toil under the sun, Solomon says. So we could talk more and more about that, but that's basically the importance there, is don't take away any of the words that Solomon used there. It doesn't just say stay together. Enjoy life with the wife whom you love. Whatever your hand finds to do, do it with all your might. Colossians chapter 3, Paul again borrows this a little bit, right? Do it unto the Lord, as he says. But Solomon again has this idea here. There's no work or thought or knowledge or wisdom in the grave. And so whatever you're going to do it with everything. Do it with everything you've got. Remember he said, enjoy your toil and so on. So then he goes into verses 11 through 18. And Solomon gets into this idea here that life has an unpredictable quality to it. And so you'll notice, and because of this unpredictable quality, again, we could grow frustrated because of life, right? The fastest runner doesn't always win the race. The strongest competitor doesn't always win the battle. You look at sports, sometimes the best team doesn't win. And that just happens, right? And the bread doesn't always go to the wise. The intelligent don't always gain riches, and all these different things, right? And he says because time and chance happens to them all. Now, the interesting thing here is this could be frustrating, but it also could be encouraging. Because if you're not the strongest, sometimes you might win the battle. If you're not the fastest, sometimes you might win the race, right? And so it's good or bad. But it's just not predictable. Life just doesn't always work according to the formula. It's supposed to, but it doesn't always. And Solomon introduces something in verse 11 that sometimes people have difficulty with when they believe in God. Time and chance happens to everybody. Time and chance happens to everybody. And so he goes on and he says there is a cruel reality about life. And the cruel reality about life is the unpredictability of it. And he actually says in verse 12 that the children of men are snared at an evil time when it suddenly falls upon them. That sometimes we weren't planning to die, and it happens. And you've been there, I've been there, where you say, I can't believe this happened, right? I wasn't ready for it, I wasn't prepared, and it does, and it's a cruel reality. In verses 13 through 18, he goes back to the benefit of wisdom, and he goes into this, that wisdom has great power, and wisdom can deliver a city. And so sometimes, remember, the battle's not to the strongest, remember, sometimes? And he says, he gives this example of these two cities or two kings or whatever, and there's a great king coming against this little city, and the little city's doomed but this poor wise man has words of wisdom and delivers the city. And he delivers it. But this is the problem, though. So wisdom has this great benefit, and everyone knows wisdom is better than foolishness. Wisdom has this great benefit. And then he says, however, but no one remembers that poor man. Wisdom is better than might, but the poor man's wisdom is despised, and his words are not heard. And if the poor are discounted, and that's a sad reality, right? If they're poor, sometimes people look at them and say they must not know how to live life very well. And so their words are discounted, but sometimes among the poor is great wisdom. And yet they're discounted by some. And it seems some prefer the loudest voice over the wisest one. And we see evidence of that as well. He goes on in verse 18, wisdom is better than weapons of war, but one sinner destroys much good. And so in chapter 10, we're not going to read all of chapter 10, but I want to read chapter 10, verses 1 through 9, and then we'll just kind of skim over the rest of chapter 10. But I encourage you to read it. I don't want to discount it. I don't want to make it seem like it's not as important. It just, you'll see as you read through. He says, beginning in verse 1, dead flies make the perfumer's ointment give off a stench, so a little folly outweighs wisdom and honor. A wise man's heart inclines him to the right, but a fool's heart to the left. Even when the fool walks on the road, he lacks sense, and he says to everyone that he is a fool. If the anger of the ruler rises against you, do not leave your place, for calmness will lay great offenses to rest. There is an evil that I have seen under the sun, as it were an error proceeding from the ruler. Folly is set in many high places, and the rich sit in a low place. I have seen slaves on horses and princes walking on the ground like slaves. He who digs a pit will fall into it, and a serpent will bite him who breaks through a wall. He who quarries stones is hurt by them, and he who splits logs is endangered by them. And so there's a lot of practical advice here, but I think we'll kind of go. So at the end of chapter 9 and verse 18, he says, wisdom is better than weapons of war, but one sinner destroys much good. One sinner destroys much good. And we've seen evidence of this, right? One sinner destroys much good. Now, we could talk about groups of people, right? That one sinner destroys much good. And the Hebrew writer talked about that to beware that a root, right? A root of bitterness might rise up and defiles the many, he says in the book of Hebrews, chapter 10. And we have to be on guard about that. And so, chapter 11, sorry. And then, no, again, sorry, I'm off on that, chapter 12. Anyways, and then again, he says it here in chapter 9, verse 18, but watch now in chapter 10 and verse 1, it sounds a little more individual, right? Dead flies make the perfumer's ointment give off a stench, so a little folly outweighs wisdom and honor. A little foolishness outweighs wisdom and honor. Now, back in chapter 2 of Ecclesiastes and verse 13, Solomon says, then I saw that there is more gain in wisdom than in folly. So in chapter 2, he says there's more gain in wisdom than in folly, but now in chapter 10 and verse 1, he says a little folly outweighs wisdom and honor. Well, which is it, Solomon? Well, if you look at chapter 2, he's just comparing wisdom and foolishness. And as characteristics of life, wisdom is better than foolishness. So if you've got a choice to do the wise thing or the foolish thing, it's much better to do the wise thing. But in chapter 10, he's now talking about your life, right? And you might have done a lot of wise things, a lot of honorable things, but you engage in some foolishness, and that outweighs the wisdom and the honorable stuff. And it does. This foolishness, which is not just goofing around a little bit. This lack of morality. This lack of moral sense outweighs wisdom and honor. You know, this is so important when we look at the world today. And he goes on, and he says in verse 3, even when the fool walks on the road, he lacks sense. He doesn't know which way to go, and he's declaring to everyone that he's a fool. So he gives some practical advice in verse 4. He talks about rulers again, right? And sandwiched here, rulers. If the anger of the ruler rises against you, don't leave your place. And notice the advice here. He says, calmness will lay great offenses to rest. That you being calm will lay great offenses to rest. Now, there's sometimes when in history a ruler's been maniacal and there's nothing you could do to stop him. There's just nothing you could do. But again, like, this is an important attribute here. Calmness will lay great offenses to rest. He talks about foolishness among high places, among rulers, and what happens, right? Like all these, the world gets turned upside down. And then he gets into this longer section, verses 8 through 20, I believe. And it's more like the Proverbs again. But you'll notice the two that I read, verse 8 and verse 9, is it goes back to that kind of like unpredictability of life. And the children of men are snared, right? And they just can't predict it happening. And this is what kind of happens, right? Like the person might be working and digging a pit, and you can fall into it. Or you're working on a wall, and a snake is hidden in a wall, and he comes through and bites you. And you just wouldn't have seen that coming. And you're working with stones, and the stone falls on you and hurts you, or something like that. And just different things happen, right? Like accidents at work. You're just doing what you're supposed to be doing, and some freak accident happens. And this is kind of like the unpredictability of life again. You just can't predict when negative stuff is going to happen to you. He goes through, right, like, if iron is blunt, you have to use more strength. Some of these things are just good, practical advice or wisdom. Verse 11, if the serpent bites before it is charmed, no advantage to the charmer. Well, that's true, right? And there's nothing you could do about that. He gets into verses 12 through 14, and again, self-discipline with regard to speech. This can't be stated enough, right? James talked about the power of the tongue, right? And Jesus said every careless word, every reckless word that a person speaks, every one, he will have to give an account for on the day of judgment. That's quite sobering there. Every careless word you'll have to give an account for on the day of judgment. And so he talks about, again, having this kind of self-restraint in speech. It says in verse 12, the words of a wise man's mouth win him favor, but the lips of a fool consume him. The beginning of the words of his mouth is foolishness, and the end of his talk is evil madness. A fool multiplies words, though no man knows what is to be, and who can tell him what will be after him. And so you see this comparison, right, of self-restraint in speech and the fool multiplying words. And so Solomon, again, talks about that. He goes through again about kings, and when you have a mature king, a more wise king, you're better off. Although, even that doesn't go always 100% according to plan. If you think back to Israel's day, sometimes the boy kings were the most successful kings. They were better than the older kings that ruled. Again, like basic stuff. Verse 18, through sloth the roof sinks in, and through indolence the house leaks. And this is just, hard work, right? Just making sure. Bread is made for laughter, and wine gladdens life, and money answers everything. And he goes through this self-restraint again. Even in your thought, do not curse the king, nor in your bedroom curse the rich, for the bird of the air will carry your voice, or some winged creature will tell the matter. And this is an important thing that Solomon was talking about anyways, is that word travels fast. And there are people who will be all too eager to repeat what you're saying. And so for your own safety, don't do this, he says. And so that kind of runs us through chapter 9 and chapter 10. It brings us to chapter 11. And we're going to do chapter 11 in 1 week and then chapter 12 to conclude it, because this is where we really want to get going. We wanted to get going to right from the beginning. It's such a different tone than what Solomon sounded like he was saying back in chapter 1 and chapter 2. But Solomon really does bring us to a great philosophy about life, right? It's just like there's so much unpredictability of life. There's so much about life that humans cannot control. Understanding God's place and our place, understanding our limits, that our limits on affecting life, our limits on improving life, and all these different things, right? And understanding that allows us to live more in the moment. And when we live more in the moment, allows us to take notice of the blessings God has given us. It allows us to take more notice of companionship and fellowship and food and toil and all these different things that we are privileged to enjoy. And so that's going to bring us, because God has not been removed from the picture. And Solomon is going to help us understand that in chapter 11 and chapter 12. We do want to remind everyone that Sunday morning at 10:15, we're going to be in lesson 2 on the journey of my soul. That's based from Isaiah chapter 6. Remember, Isaiah sees God high and lifted up, and the awakening to the reality of God. Isaiah's first words are, woe is me, right? And we're going to go to stage 2 of the journey, which is a difficult stage, but it's a very important stage. So that's 10:15 at the church building. We're going to be in lesson 3 here at 11:30 on rousing a king up with Queen Esther, to see how Esther gets involved now that every Jew in the entire kingdom of Persia is in despair, right? Is finding life to be too overwhelming for the moment. They're certain that they're going to be destroyed. How does Esther come in, and how does a king get raised up? That's going to be 11:30 live on the YouTube channel. And we hope every one of you is having a great week. I know fall is upon us, and yet the weather is still kind of warm and enjoyable. So please bow with me in prayer. Father God, we are so thankful for you. We're thankful that you watch over us. We're thankful you give us so many good things in life to enjoy. Help us, Father, to notice the blessings. Help us to learn from the curses and to notice the blessings, Father. Father, even though life is unpredictable, we know that we are in your hands. And because we're in your hands, things are going to be all right. Be with our friends, be with our neighbors. Help us, Father, to be the type of people you want us to be around them. It is through Jesus' name we pray. Amen. God bless everyone.